Hello! October 27th, 1962. Somewhere in the Caribbean, roughly 60 feet underwater, a Soviet submarine is being hunted by the entire United States Navy. Inside, the temperature has hit 140 degrees Fahrenheit. The air is running out. Nobody on board has heard from Moscow in days. And 3 men are standing around a small metal room, about to vote on whether to launch a nuclear torpedo. 2 of them vote yes. If that third guy had also voted yes, there's a very real chance none of us would be here right now. Not in a dramatic, exaggerating, four-views kind of way. Historians who study this event genuinely believe it. And I'll show you exactly why by the end of this video. This is the story of Vasili Arkhipov, the single most important person in history that almost nobody has heard of. Historically, Facts, Part 29. The setup. Let's rewind about 2 weeks. It's the Cuban Missile Crisis, which you've probably heard of in the vague sense of Kennedy and Khrushchev almost blew up the world over some missiles in Cuba. That part's true. In October 1962, American spy planes discover the Soviet Union has been secretly installing nuclear missile sites in Cuba, roughly 90 miles off the coast of Florida. For 13 days, the 2 superpowers sit in the closest thing the Cold War ever had to an actual countdown clock. President Kennedy orders a naval blockade around the island. Soviet ships keep sailing toward it anyway. Nobody quite knows who's going to blink first, and both sides have enough nuclear weapons pointed at each other to end organized civilization several times over. What most people don't know is that while Kennedy and Khrushchev were staring each other down on the surface, in full view of the entire world's media, 4 Soviet submarines were quietly creeping toward Cuba underwater, and the United States Navy had absolutely no idea these submarines were carrying nuclear weapons. Each of these subs, designated the Foxtrot class, was carrying a single nuclear torpedo. Not a nuke strapped to a missile that flies somewhere far away, launched from a safe distance. A torpedo, meant to be fired at close range at an enemy ship, underwater, from a vessel that would almost certainly be destroyed in the blast right alongside its target. Whoever fired this weapon was not expecting to survive doing it. The Soviet High Command's thinking here is, charitably, let's send some nuclear weapons toward the country we're already in a massive standoff with, but not clearly tell every relevant party exactly how dangerous these particular submarines are. Bold strategy. The captains were told they were carrying a special weapon, which, if you're a submarine commander in 1962, you can probably guess what that means, but the exact authorization procedures for actually using it were murky at best. One of these 4 submarines is the B-59, commanded by Captain Valentin Savitsky. And on board, in a role that will become extremely relevant very shortly, is the flotilla's second-in-command, Vasili Arkhipov. Now here's the detail that makes Arkhipov's presence on this particular boat almost unbelievably lucky, and it's worth slowing down on for a second, because it matters enormously for what happens later. He wasn't just some random officer with no relevant experience. A year earlier, in 1961, he had served as executive officer aboard a different Soviet submarine, the K-19, during a genuine nuclear reactor meltdown. The K-19's cooling system failed catastrophically, and the crew, with essentially no proper protective equipment, had to physically enter the reactor compartment to jury-rig a fix using scavenged parts, absorbing massive doses of radiation in the process. 8 of them died within weeks. Many more died slowly over the following years. It was later turned into a Hollywood film starring Harrison Ford, because of course it was. Arkhipov survived that. He personally witnessed, up close, what radiation poisoning actually does to a human body over time, not as an abstract statistic in a briefing document, but as something he watched happen to his own crewmates. He understood, in a way almost nobody else on the B-59 did, exactly what nuclear consequences actually cost. That's the guy who happens to be standing in that room, about to cast the deciding vote. Keep that in mind. The isolation. So the B-59 is creeping toward Cuba, trying to stay hidden when the US Navy detects it on the surface. And here's where things start going very wrong, very fast. The Americans decide the best way to force a Soviet submarine to surface is to drop practice depth charges near it. Small explosive charges, not meant to actually destroy the submarine, just meant to signal, "We see you, come up and identify yourself." The idea being that any reasonable submarine crew would understand this, per standard naval signaling procedure, as a warning shot rather than an attack. Problem is, nobody told the Soviet crew that these were harmless signaling charges, because there was no reliable way to tell them anything at all. As far as the men inside the B-59 are concerned, they are underwater, being actively depth-charged by the United States Navy, with zero way of knowing whether this is a warning or the opening move of an actual shooting war, and they have no way to check. Soviet submarines of this era had essentially no reliable way to communicate with Moscow while submerged, and surfacing to communicate risked exposing their position and their cargo entirely. No news updates, no radio confirmation that the crisis hadn't already escalated into open conflict on the surface. For all they know, World War III started days ago, and they are the very last people on Earth to find out, currently being actively attacked as living proof of it. Meanwhile, conditions inside the submarine have become genuinely brutal, and this part deserves more attention than it usually gets in the retelling. The air conditioning has failed. Temperatures in some compartments reportedly reach 140 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough that crew members are collapsing. Carbon dioxide levels are climbing steadily because the boat can't surface to properly ventilate without risking detection and attack. Fresh water is running low. Crew members are, by multiple surviving accounts, fainting from heat exhaustion and oxygen deprivation, one after another, in a slow-motion crisis happening entirely separate from the geopolitical one above them. This isn't a metaphorical pressure cooker. It is, quite literally, a sealed metal container, heating up, with people slowly cooking inside it, while also being shaken by explosions they have no way of confirming aren't lethal. Captain Savitsky, understandably, is not doing great mentally at this point. Cut off from command for days, convinced war has very likely already started somewhere above him, sitting in what is functionally an oven with dwindling breathable air, being repeatedly rattled by detonations close enough to feel through the hull. The vote. Now, here's the part that determines whether you're watching this video right now or whether none of us exist at all. Soviet protocol for these particular submarines required that launching the nuclear torpedo needed agreement from 3 officers on board: the captain, the political officer, and the second in command. All 3. Unanimous. No majority rule, no override, no exceptions. Savitsky, convinced they were already at war and about to be destroyed regardless of what he did, decides they should launch the nuclear torpedo at the American fleet surrounding them. His reported reasoning, according to surviving crew accounts given decades later, was something along the lines of, "We're going to die down here either way, so we might as well take them with us." Not an unreasonable conclusion, honestly, if you genuinely believe the war has already started and this is simply how the story ends. The political officer, whose entire job on Soviet vessels was partly to enforce ideological discipline, agrees with him. That's 2 out of 3. If Arkhipov, the third and final vote, also agrees, the launch proceeds. A nuclear torpedo gets fired at a US Navy fleet during the single most tense standoff of the entire Cold War. Nobody on the American side has any way of knowing this launch wasn't ordered directly by Moscow as the deliberate start of a full nuclear exchange. The retaliation would be immediate, overwhelming, and almost certainly would not stay limited to just Cuba or just this one submarine. Arkhipov says no, and not a quiet, hesitant no either. By multiple accounts pieced together decades later, he argued forcefully, insisting they had no actual confirmation that war had started, that the depth charges could very reasonably be signals rather than an attack, and that launching a nuclear weapon based on incomplete information, cut off from command in a state of extreme physical and mental exhaustion, was not a decision they were authorized or justified to make on their own, no matter how bad things looked in that moment. He was not the most senior officer on that boat. Savitsky technically outranked him within the ship's own chain of command. But because of the specific unanimous vote requirement built into this particular submarine class's LA, he was not the most senior officer on that boat. Savitsky technically outranked him within the ship's own chain of command. But because of the specific unanimous vote requirement built into this particular submarine class's launch protocol, one man without the formal authority to overrule his own captain still had, functionally, a personal veto over the end of the world. Eventually, after what surviving accounts describe as a heated, exhausting argument in unbearable heat, Arkhipov convinces Savitsky to surface the submarine instead of firing. The B-59 comes up, immediately gets surrounded and confronted by US destroyers, and after a tense but non-nuclear standoff on the surface, is eventually allowed to turn around and return to the Soviet Union. No torpedo, no war. Just a very hot, very exhausted crew, and one man's stubborn refusal to make an irreversible decision on incomplete information. The aftermath. Here's the part that's almost more unsettling than the crisis itself. Nobody found out about any of this for decades. The Soviet Union had no interest in publicizing that one of their submarines had nearly triggered a nuclear war due to a breakdown in communication and unbearable onboard conditions. That's not exactly a flattering story for a military to tell about itself. The United States, meanwhile, didn't fully understand how close they'd come either, because they had no idea the B-59 was carrying a nuclear weapon in the first place, and absolutely no idea their supposedly harmless signaling depth charges were being interpreted, quite reasonably given the circumstances, as an active attack. It wasn't until the 1990s, after the Cold War had already ended and Soviet archives began quietly opening up, that documents and testimonies from surviving crew members began revealing what had actually happened inside that submarine on that specific day. Thomas Blanton, who later became director of the National Security Archive, put it about as directly as anyone has. A guy named Vasili Arkhipov essentially single-handedly saved the world, and for most of his life, almost nobody outside a small circle of Soviet naval officers had any idea it had happened. Arkhipov didn't get a medal for this at the time. He didn't get a movie made about him. He went on serving quietly in the Soviet Navy for years afterward, eventually reaching the rank of vice admiral, and died in 1998 from complications related to the radiation exposure he'd absorbed decades earlier during that K-19 reactor incident, the same event that had given him the first-hand, unforgettable understanding of nuclear consequences that likely shaped his decision on the B-59 in the first place. He never publicly made a big deal out of any of it. By most accounts from people who knew him, he simply didn't see it as something worth boasting about. He'd done his job under impossible conditions, and that was that. Closing. There's something genuinely strange about how history actually works once you dig into stories like this one. We tend to imagine massive historical turning points as being decided by presidents, generals, huge armies, sweeping decisions made in war rooms with large maps on the walls and rows of advisors. And sometimes that's exactly how it happens. But sometimes the entire trajectory of human history comes down to one exhausted man in a 140-degree metal tube underwater, cut off from any real information, physically and mentally worn down to almost nothing, choosing to say no when it would have been so much easier in the moment to just agree with everyone else in the room. 2 out of 3 votes were already in favor of launching a nuclear weapon during the single most dangerous standoff of the Cold War. The only reason that number isn't 3 out of 3 is that one specific person happened to be standing in that specific room with the specific memory of what radiation actually does to people, and the specific stubbornness to argue against his own captain in the middle of what he genuinely believed might already be a war that had already started without him. Vasili Arkhipov never asked to be the reason the world didn't end. He just refused to agree to something he didn't have enough information to justify. That's it. That's the whole story. No grand speech, no dramatic final stand, no medal ceremony. Just one exhausted man in a hot metal room saying, essentially, I don't think we should do that, at the exact moment in history when it mattered more than at almost any other point before or since. Subscribe, become a member, and the next time you think one person can't possibly make a difference, remember, there's a very real chance you owe your entire existence to a guy in a submarine who simply refused to sign off on the end of the world.